It's time for Drive-By Discernment with Paul Taylor and Todd Friel.
What you are about to hear has nothing to do with trendy teenage clothing. Thanks for that, Friel. Welcome to Lecture 25 in Drive-By Discernment. Paul Taylor from Great Britain, now actually living in Florida, but he still has that accent, talking about another compromise on the gospel. It is the gap theory. No, I'm not proud of that. Here's Paul Taylor.
So the second compromise we're going to look at is the gap theory, the idea that between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 1, verse 2, there is a gap. They therefore interpret the verse 2 this way. They say that verse 2, where it says the earth was without form and void, should say the earth became without form and void. The earth became without form and void. They say that there's a gap between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and 1, verse 2. They say that in that gap there were millions and millions of years when all the creatures were around, lots of creatures and pre-Adamic man were around, and Lucifer was around ruling all this, and eventually Lucifer fell, and God destroyed that world in a flood called the Luciferian flood, and that explains the millions of years of fossils in the rock, they say. So that's what they say happened during that gap. They maintain that when in Genesis chapter 1 it talks about the command to man to replenish the earth, that means that if it has to be replenished, then there must have been something there before, they say. So they're refilling the earth. I'll come on to the use of the word replenish in a moment. Those are the three principles that they really hang on to. Now, does the Hebrew grammar allow for a gap in Genesis chapter 1? Well, here's the actual passage we're looking at. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light. There are lots of ands in the King James Version. Why? Let's have a look. Those squiggles on the screen, I understand, are Hebrew letters, so I've been told. Now, I have to take this from experts, and you can see this on the Answers in Genesis website if you have a look. But what I understand is that the word and that's used in the King James Version is actually very important. It's not grammatically incorrect. It's there because, of course, there was no punctuation in the Hebrew. And really, the whole of that first section reads in a very breathless manner. It would actually not be incorrect to read this passage really fast. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep. You can't stop and draw breath because it's all one passage. One thing follows straight after the other. And apparently I'm told that that is what the Hebrew implies. If, therefore, you wanted a gap between verse 1 and verse 2, to be consistent, you would have to have a gap halfway through verse 2 as well, and another gap between verse 2 and verse 3, which I notice the gap theorists don't actually want. So the Hebrew grammar then apparently does not allow for a gap there. There is more to it than that. I haven't got on the screen here Exodus chapter 20 verse 11, but I think we should mention that. Exodus chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments. And you know that only one of the commandments actually has a reason for it. The commandment number 4, where we are told that we are to keep 1 day in 7 holy. 1 day in 7 holy, we're told that there is a reason for that commandment. And in verse 11, this is the reason. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. Hold on a minute. Verse 1 of Genesis says, in the beginning God made the heavens and the earth. And then the gap theorists say that the 6 days came afterwards, after a gap. But Exodus 20 verse 11 says, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. So the making of the heavens and the earth is part of the 6 days, according to Exodus 20 verse 11. Now, if the gap theorists don't want to believe that, then they have to say that Moses has got it wrong in the Ten Commandments. If the reason for the fourth commandment is not true, then how can we actually accept the fourth commandment itself? If we don't accept the fourth commandment, then why do we need to accept the other 9? And we might as well throw the whole lot away. We don't even have 10 commandments then, we just have 10 suggestions. Another argument used in the gap theory is the idea that where it says the earth was without form and void, that has got a parallel in Jeremiah. They say, well, let's look at Jeremiah, and that will explain to us what without form and void means. And in Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23, we will concede that the phrase without form and void does look as if it's something that's imperfect, that's not very good. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. It does appear to be something that's not very good. But this is where you've got to understand that the meaning of the phrase in Jeremiah has to be explained by the meaning of the phrase in Genesis, not the other way round. because the phrase in Genesis came first. Let me give you another example of that so you can get the point. Supposing that some sports coach said about what their team had done that this was their finest hour. Why would they use a phrase like that? They would only use a phrase like that because people know what that phrase comes from. That Winston Churchill first used that phrase about the RAF when they won the Battle of Britain, when they kept Britain safe from invasion from the German Air Force. So the phrase had its meaning in what Churchill said, and then a sports coach used that and was then able to apply that to a sporting triumph. It does not make sense to put it the other way round. You can't think of Churchill scratching around for saying, what phrase shall I use? I know, someone won some match in the past, I'll use their phrase. It wasn't that way round at all. Churchill's saying came first, and we interpret what the sports coach says by referring back to the first use. So when we see it there, in order to understand what Jeremiah is saying, we refer back to Genesis, not the other way around. We do not interpret the phrase in Genesis by looking at what it says in Jeremiah. I hope that seems to make sense in this particular case. It's quite important. There is no implication at all that the phrase in Genesis implies imperfection. It doesn't imply that there's anything wrong with it. It simply implies that it is not complete. Okay? God looked at all he'd made and he said it was good. And he said it was good, and he said it was good. But at the end, he said it's very good, because now it was complete. Before it was complete, he only said it was good, because it wasn't finished. So that's what it implies. It implies that God has made the earth, but it's formless at the moment. It needs finishing off. Now, what about this word replenish? You know, it's only the King James Version that uses this particular word. I hope I don't offend people here, because I'm not going to knock the King James Version. The King James Version is correct. But so are the other versions, when the other versions interpret Genesis chapter 1, verse 22, as saying, go forth and fill the earth. And the problem is not with the interpretation, the problem is with the change in the English language. Because, in fact, the word replenish in 1611 did not mean the same as it means today. Do you realize that? The word replenish does not mean to plenish again, because there is no such thing as the word plenish. Okay? So you can't plenish something again. In fact, the etymology of the word is the same as replete. It actually means to fill, or rather, it actually meant in 1611 to fill completely, not to fill again. Okay? So the King James Version was right. But it is interesting to note, by the way, that in 1599, earlier than the King James Version, the Geneva Bible used the word fill.
No. I'm not so pathetic that I'd actually use a fill joke there. That was Paul Taylor and the gap theory, but there are more contortions of Genesis. Apparently, people with an awful lot of free time want to take something that is clear and obvious and turn it into something else. That was Lecture 25 of Drive-By Discernment.